I have a fairly mellow Discord if you want to join us there for a bit of conversation and debate. We have people from all over, really, and for the most part, it's fairly good-natured and peaceful. As long as you come in that kind of spirit, you'll be fine. Hello, lovelies. Sorry for the lack of updates, but I've been kind of mildly overwhelmed between work and news events and stuff going on in the gaming community. Plus, I have a shitload of Degenesis books to go through and review, and a shitload of Lamentations of the Flame Princess books to review and go through, and more stuff on the way for me to review. So, yeah, it's just seemed kind of insurmountable, but let's knock a couple of these things out of the way with some RPG community news headlines, I guess, and my hot take on them. Firstly, the new TSR saga continues with Justin Lanassa and whatever incarnation of new TSR we're on now, looking to sue or otherwise get a legal declaration so that they can adopt the orphaned works of the old TSR from Wizards of the Coast. I personally don't particularly trust Lanassa. I think he is attempting to exploit the situation to raise money for himself, and to ride on the kind of culture war clash between older school gamers and new school gamers who seem to think that the past was some kind of hotbed of bigotry and hatred for some reason. Certainly the Wizards of the Coast disclaimer on old products doesn't exactly help there. So there are two prongs to this case. The one part is they're trying to get a legal declaration of ownership over properties that were abandoned by Wizards of the Coast. Trademarks they let lapse, all of that sort of thing. So that's one aspect of it. They could claim things like, probably not Alternity because it had a more modern edition, but things like Star Frontiers and so on. Trademarks, copyrights and so on, they can lapse. Things can lapse into the public domain in a variety of ways. In this case, we're not looking at something really lapsing into the public domain so much as it's something where they haven't produced anything, haven't done anything with it, haven't really claimed any ownership over it, and so the new TSR wants to claim ownership of this abandoned project, book, whatever you want to call it. This can happen with things like abandoned buildings and abandoned vehicles and so on. And it costs anything from a few $100s to a couple of $1,000s to get a declaration of ownership, where you basically claim ownership of something that has been abandoned. Can they do it? Maybe. Things did lapse. There were claims and products and so on. So yeah, it's possible. But Wizards obviously has more money, particularly Hasbro money, behind it, which makes me think that regardless of the merits of the case, one way or the other, it's unlikely to go anywhere simply because Hasbro and Wizards have deeper pockets. Are they morally justified in doing so? Well, that's separate to the legal question, and that's down to you to figure out, I guess.
Isn't that rather unethical behaviour?
Oh, is it? I'm afraid I'm a bit out of touch.
But there are abandonware sites for software online where you can find old games for PCs and even older forms of computers that have basically just been let lie fallow, and then they've been picked up. And these sites allow you to download and play these old games that nobody really has any claim over anymore. So it's certainly something that can happen. And if anything, people who were involved in the old TSR have a certain amount of moral and ethical right to claim ownership of abandoned works that they worked on than anyone else. So I think the fundraising is likely scammy. You should probably stay away from it, but it does raise some interesting questions about older RPGs and about piracy sites that offer scans and so on of these older legacy RPGs that have essentially been abandoned by companies that have been wound up and so on. The other aspect to this case, which doesn't seem to have had any sort of filing, is to use some leverage to try and get Wizards of the Coast to drop the disclaimer from the legacy products for D&D, which they do still sell, and thereby claim ownership over. This is tricky. Now, I'm obviously more familiar with English libel and slander laws, which are a lot more draconian and tend to favour the person suing a lot more than the laws in the US. So, and I know the US laws tend to err more on the side of you being free to slander and libel anyone you want with relative impunity. Is there a case here, though? Well, from my perspective, as a Brit, I would say there probably would be if it was under English law. Because these disclaimers in the front of these legacy products, what they do is they imply that everyone who was involved in working on the old games was somehow a bigot or a racist or a homophobe or whatever else. It says, values were different back then. We're talking about the 70s and 80s, really. We're not talking about prehistory. We're talking about a time post-gender equality in law. We're talking about a time, after the sort of ultra-liberal period of hippiedom and so on. So the idea that this was some sort of wasteland of bigotry and hatred is absurd, particularly when applied to the role-playing hobby, which has always been more progressive, more accepting, generally speaking in a good way until recently, than the culture around it. Perhaps because we're all weirdos, freaks and nerds, and if you're all outcasts together, that kind of binds you together. So I think there is an argument to be made there that basically anyone who was involved in the production of those old products, those products that now have this disclaimer on it, do have a claim for reputational and possibly even financial damages done to them by these disclaimers, branding their old work and them as somehow being bigots or racists or homophobes or whatever it is. So there is a case there. It's not completely absurd. Neither of these claims is completely absurd. Orphaned works are a thing, and you can try to assert a declaration of ownership over them. It's not completely absurd. It's possible. And that disclaimer, certainly it pisses me off, and I didn't even produce any of those works particularly. So I think there is an argument to be made there about reputational and potential financial harm. A lot of the old creators seem to have fallen afoul of a sort of witch hunt. Now, while I don't particularly rate New TSR and don't think they're honest actors, I have no regrets about cutting a few people off due to their hideous nastiness towards New TSR and their lack of respect to the older creators who helped bring about this hobby that we all love so much. And I am extremely disappointed to see gamers who were around in those older days, who know they weren't full of bigotry and hatred and nastiness, going along with this witch hunt. And I'm really pissed off with the reaction to this. There's no sympathy whatsoever. There's no understanding whatsoever of how this rebranding, this historical revisionism really does cut people to the bone and hurt them. Instead, all we've got in response to these stories is mostly a bunch of entirely predictable reaction gifs. So I guess we'll see how this all goes. But I don't think anyone involved on any side is looking particularly shiny. The other big gaming story, I guess, that grabbed my eye was that a vendor at Dragon Meet was verbally attacked and berated about the Carbon 2185 game, and apparently it not fulfilling its Kickstarter or whatever else. The person selling it had nothing to do with that Kickstarter or anything else to do with the game other than selling it at Dragon Meet, so that was very much the wrong target to go after. But this yet again shows a bunch of problems around crowdfunding that I've talked about before, but it's worth reiterating, and it does really bother me. Crowdfunding projects, whether through Kickstarter or Indiegogo or some other lesser site, or whether people run the crowdfunding themselves, this is not meant to be a pre-order system. This is not meant to be a guarantee that you get anything at the end of it, right? I might agonize over getting stuff produced and pull out all the stops and burn through a lot more money, as I am with Whitechester right now because of my health issues. But not everyone's like that, and not everyone can deliver on it. It's one of the few criticisms of Zoe Quinn that I think isn't particularly valid, though it has some validity since an effort doesn't even appear to have been made to produce games or projects in time. But the point is, you're not a purchaser, you're not a customer, you're an investor when you back one of these projects, and an investment can either pay off or it can't. By investing your money, you maybe allow a project to go ahead or attempt to go ahead that wouldn't otherwise be capable of going ahead. And that's pretty much it. So you can't guarantee that you get anything that they offer, and you should never go into a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo project thinking that you're going to get what you paid for at all or on time, right? So my recent experience kind of speaks to that. So I was aiming for a February release for Whitechester. It's likely to be a month or even two late, possibly even a little bit more, though I don't think so. Why? Because despite factoring in issues like depression into the timetable, I didn't factor in the fact that I was going to suffer enormous hypertension and nearly have a stroke and nearly die. So, yeah, the best laid plans often go astray. And if I had suffered an aneurysm or a stroke or whatever and wasn't able to complete the job or had died, you would simply be stuck. You would be up shit creek. You would not be getting anything for that project. Them's the breaks. It's a risk. It's an investment. This idea that people have that this is a pre-order system seems to have come about because big companies, relatively speaking, that don't actually need to raise Kickstarter money or Indiegogo money, crowdfunding money, that don't need to raise that to produce their project, have been using it as a pre-order system.
That is a cunt move.
And this has created a degree of unrealistic expectation in the audience that backs these projects, that it is essentially a pre-order system.
Dumb cunt.
It's not. So this anger is misplaced. You're making a bet. You're investing in this project in the hopes that it will pay off. But there's no guarantee. Stop treating it like a pre-order system. I wish big companies would stop abusing crowdfunding to take away risk to them when they produce their products, but I think it'll be a cold day in hell before Kickstarter turns away that kind of money and before these companies turn away from using it as both publicity and an amelioration of risk. But that's not what it's supposed to be. It's not what it was ever intended for. It was intended for new startups and small independent companies to be able to raise capital without looking for, proper investors. But, people dick everything up. Sang. "Rrrr," said the grinder as it chewed its way through Alice from the crown of her head all the way down to her toes. It ate the lot of her, unfussy, snout to tail, and cleared its plate. It gnashed its way through her dress, her pinafore, her shoes, and her unmentionables. It chewed her hair, devoured her scalp, gobbled up her arms, wolfed down her legs, gorged itself on her torso, noshed on her skin, and gulped her down without so much as a burp to show for it.
Now, Bob, consider this next question very carefully. What is your one purpose in life?
To explode, of course.